You were never supposed to hear this. What I'm about to tell you was buried under stone and silence for nearly a century, locked away in the forbidden archives of men who feared what it might do to the faithful if the truth came out. 4 women. A brutal Utah winter. One man named Ezekiel Whitmore. And a secret so dangerous the church itself spent generations erasing it. But history has a way of whispering through the cracks, doesn't it? Imagine a cabin isolated by 8 miles of snow and silence. Inside, 4 wives moving in eerie harmony, each with the same scar carved across their wrist, each finishing the other's sentences as if they were pieces of one mind. And then, gone. No footprints in the snow. No bodies. Just a husband who trembled as he spoke, shifting his stories like a man weaving rope from lies. What happened that winter of 1847 wasn't a family tragedy. It wasn't survival gone wrong. It was something far older. Something ritualistic. And once you hear what was found beneath that frozen ground decades later, you'll understand why those in power wanted silence more than justice. Because silence protects institutions. Silence preserves illusions. And silence feeds control. This isn't just a story about one man and 4 women. This is a story about the machinery of faith, the manipulation of obedience, and how the seeds of madness grow when power is draped in the name of God. Stay with me. You're about to descend into a secret that doesn't just change history, it changes you. The Utah Territory of 1847 was a land carved out of desperation. Brigham Young had declared, "This is the place," staring across a desert that looked more like a punishment than a promised land. But the exiled faithful obeyed, believing persecution had forged them into chosen vessels. Into this valley came Ezekiel Whitmore, a carpenter from Vermont, with 4 wives bound to him under the principle of plural marriage. On paper, his family was a model of devotion. Sarah, barren but steadfast; Rebecca, sharp-minded and questioning; Mary, heavy with child; Ruth, barely 19, still smelling of girlhood. But behind the facade of order, isolation twists people into shapes they were never meant to be. In Whitmore's cabin, witnesses spoke of a strange energy, 4 women too synchronized, too silent. Their harmony was not natural, it was rehearsed, as if drilled into them by an unseen hand. Their marks, thin deliberate cuts, all the same depth, could not be accidents. To the bishop who visited, they seemed more like initiations. And here's the truth institutions never confess: obedience is a drug. In isolation it becomes a poison. Plural marriage was not merely about family, it was about control. Bodies, minds, souls. And in Whitmore's cabin, that control metastasized into something darker. It's easy to dismiss one man as a fanatic. But was Whitmore acting alone, or was he carrying out whispers of doctrine too dangerous to be written down? The answer lies not just in what was seen, but in what was heard in the dead of night beneath the cabin floor. January 1848. Snow walls off the world. The only paths are wind-carved ridges and frozen rivers where no sane traveler would dare cross. Yet Ezekiel Whitmore appears in the settlement, gaunt, trembling, his eyes hollow. He tells the bishop that Sarah, his first wife, has left, compelled by a revelation to travel east to care for a sister. A sister who never existed. No one would leave in the dead of winter. No woman could survive such a journey. The bishop's journal records something chilling. Ezekiel would not allow him to see the other wives, claiming they were in spiritual purification, hidden away in silence. When pressed, his story changed. First it was missionaries she left with, then it was mountain men who knew secret routes. His hands shook. His eyes darted. Guilt disguised as revelation. The settlement whispered, but the bishop stayed silent. Why? Because to question Ezekiel openly was to question the institution itself. And when an institution is fighting for survival, it buries its rot beneath the snow. But the snow has a memory. And when it melts, what's buried does not stay hidden. Remember this: men lie, institutions conceal, but the earth itself always tells the truth. By February, Ezekiel returns again. Another wife gone. Another revelation. Another impossible journey east. His voice rambles of God's mysterious ways, but the bishop hears only contradictions. This time he demands to see the remaining wives. Ezekiel grows defensive, claiming fever keeps them bedridden and contagious. But the bishop is not convinced. He gathers a small party and sets out to the cabin through the snow. What they find there is worse than absence. It is silence. A silence so heavy it feels like a weight pressing against the lungs. They eat a meal of preserved foods, though fresh bread should have been there if women still managed the household. At night, one man swears he hears weeping from beneath the cabin floor. Not the moan of timber. Not the whine of wind. Weeping. Human. And yet in the morning nothing. No women's voices. No trace of feminine presence. Only Ezekiel, pale by the fire, his excuses collapsing into fragments of scripture and fevered eyes. The men return shaken, the bishop's diary heavy with doubt. But still no action. Because scandal could destroy the fragile trust holding the community together. So truth is left to freeze, hidden beneath snow and silence. But the silence does not last. It never does. Spring comes. Snow recedes. The earth exhales secrets. When the bishop finally returns to the cabin in April, he finds it abandoned, dust layering over furniture, the rooms of the wives stripped not by departure but by erasure. Under a loose floorboard, he finds Rebecca's journal, her final entry written in a trembling hand. "E says we must make the ultimate sacrifice for the eternal family. But I fear his revelations come from a darker source than heaven. Behind the cabin the earth is torn, not for root cellars but for graves. Fragments of cloth. A wedding ring. And in the ashes of ritual fires, burned scripture twisted with references to blood atonement, sacrifice, sealing through death. It is here the bishop begins to understand. This was no family leaving, no accident, no illness. It was a ritual. A sacrifice disguised as revelation. And if Ezekiel truly believed this, who taught him? Where did he learn the words? The bishop does not write this in official records. He buries it in a private journal, terrified of the scandal that could dismantle the fragile empire rising in the desert. But truth does not die with silence. Truth waits. And 70 years later, when construction workers unearthed a chamber beneath a new church, truth returned with a vengeance. October 1920. The world has changed, but Utah's soil has not forgotten. A construction crew working under the bright sun of autumn begins digging the foundation for a new meeting house. They strike stone, a chamber carefully built, it seems tight as if meant never to be opened. When they lift the cover, silence spreads across the worksite. Inside, for sets of women's clothing folded neatly. 4 purses each with identification. Sarah, Rebecca, Mary, Ruth. 4 lives reduced to artifacts. And letters. Letters written as if preparing for death, describing sacrifice as glory, blood as sealing, obedience as eternal reward. The words do not read like murder victims. They read like willing participants. And that is far more disturbing. Because manipulation so deep it convinces you to die is not madness, it's mastery. The church sends its officials. The items are gathered swiftly, locked away from the public, and the ground is smoothed as if nothing was found. But the men who opened that chamber never forgot. They whispered to their children of women who walked willingly into death believing they were ascending. And the children whispered still. You see, when truth is sealed in stone, it doesn't die. It waits for someone willing to hear its voice. Consider this. If Ezekiel Whitmore had murdered his wives against their will, history would classify him as a madman, a criminal, a beast. But if his wives agreed, if they embraced death as a covenant, then the story darkens into something worse. It becomes evidence of psychological control so absolute that life itself becomes currency for belief. What power convinces a pregnant woman to sacrifice both herself and her unborn child? What doctrine whispers that obedience through blood is the highest devotion? And why did church leaders not denounce it immediately, but instead bury it. Ask yourself, was Whitmore an isolated fanatic, or a vessel for a teaching too incendiary to be admitted openly? Blood atonement was not a fantasy. It was doctrine, spoken of, debated, feared. That some lives could only be purified by blood. That ultimate loyalty demanded ultimate cost. The letters found in that stone chamber were not delusions scrawled by the insane. They were composed, careful, almost calm. Which means manipulation had become belief, and belief had become identity. And when identity is rewritten, control is no longer external. It lives inside you. That is the kind of control institutions crave. Ask yourself, why would the church hide this story for nearly 70 years? The answer is simple. Power survives by silence. To reveal that 4 women were led into ritual death under the banner of faith would be to admit that obedience can be twisted into annihilation. And once that truth escapes, obedience loses its sheen. If followers discover that loyalty can lead not to salvation but to death, they begin to question. And questioning is a virus institutions cannot allow. So the story was buried, literally, under stone, under dirt, under chapels built to erase memory with him in prayer. But whispers spread. Locals spoke of voices in the valley, women crying in the wind. Travelers told of presences watching from the trees. Ghost stories they called them. But what if ghosts are not spirits of the dead, but memories the earth itself refuses to release? What if the land keeps score, replaying suffering until someone listens? That valley was not cursed by superstition. It was haunted by truth. And truth, unlike myth, does not fade with time. It waits, and it punishes silence. There is something most people do not understand about psychological control. It does not demand force. Chains of the body are crude. Chains of the mind are elegant. Ezekiel did not need to bind his wives with rope. He bound them with scripture, with ritual, with the promise of eternal family. He offered them the highest seat in heaven if they would only give up their earthly life. And they believed. This is the deepest form of captivity. When you kneel willingly, when you carve the knife across your own skin because you think the cut makes you holy. Institutions study this. They refine it. They need followers who obey without hesitation, who sacrifice not under threat but under conviction. Think of what this means. For women erased themselves not because they wanted death but because they wanted meaning, and someone else defined what meaning was. That is the ultimate theft, the hijacking of purpose. And if it happened once, in one cabin in the Utah snow, what makes you think it hasn't happened again and again and again, in ways more subtle, more polished, hidden beneath the institutions you trust today? By now you can feel it. The weight of this story is not just history. It's a mirror. The Whitmore case is not about 4 wives in the wilderness. It is about the machinery of power that shapes how we think, what we believe, and what we are willing to give. If faith can rewrite reality so deeply that death feels like ascension, what else has been rewritten around you? What meanings do you carry that are not yours, but were planted by others? Parents, teachers, leaders, institutions? Whitmore is not a ghost of 1847. He is a warning. A blueprint of how obedience, secrecy, and ritual converge into control so deep it can erase entire lives without protest. And yet here you are listening. That means you are different. That means you are willing to look into the abyss where most look away. But understand this, once you see you cannot unsee. Knowledge is a curse but also a weapon. And only those who choose to wield it can step beyond manipulation into mastery. The descent has begun. The question is, how far are you willing to go? The bishop's private journal speaks of something most never saw. Tucked away in a hidden compartment in Whitmore's cabin were notebooks, dozens of them. Not sermons, not scripture, but his own fevered writings. He called it the principle of ultimate consecration. His words described visions of families sealed forever through sacrifice. Not just symbolic sacrifice. Blood. He wrote of eternal families rising higher than angels if they proved their loyalty by offering their lives willingly to God. The handwriting begins neat, measured. But as the pages turn, it unravels. Sentences breaking apart, words overlapping, sketches of circles, fire pits, knives. He writes of dreams where his wives stand clothed in white, chanting hymns as they step into the fire. He writes of a voice commanding him that women were vessels of purity, and purity only becomes eternal when spilled. Most disturbing of all, he does not describe resistance. He describes their agreement, their smiles, their eagerness. He writes, "They have seen it too. They know what is required. Heaven is calling and we shall obey." If madness lives in these pages, it is not his alone. It is shared. A collective madness shaped by doctrine too volatile for open pulpits. Think carefully, how does a doctrine spread if it is too dangerous to be preached? Whisper. Suggestion. Rumor wrapped as revelation. The settlers of 1847 were not scholars of theology, they were exiles, desperate for meaning, clinging to survival in a hostile wilderness. In that crucible, any man with conviction could shape belief into law. Whitmore was not unique, he was a symptom. Blood atonement, eternal sealing, consecration through sacrifice. These were not inventions from nothing. They were ideas seated in the culture, whispered among men who hungered for absolute obedience. The church would later call these misinterpretations. But misinterpretation is only possible if the seed was already planted. And once the seed takes root, it grows in darkness, watered by fear and devotion. That's how it works. Control does not announce itself. It drips in slowly reshaping thought, until the unthinkable feels inevitable. Until four women look at each other across a fire in the snow and nod, not because they want to die but because they no longer remember that they had a choice. The ritual itself is a shadow, glimpsed only through fragments. The burned pages, the arranged fire pits, the synchronized marks on the women's wrists. Pieces of something too deliberate to be coincidence. Ezekiel wrote of circles of flame, 4 fires lit in symmetry, encircling an altar of stone. He described chants, hymns twisted with words that do not appear in any hymn book. And then, the offering. Not bound, not dragged, but willing. The journals hint that it was not death by knife, but fire. A purification, he called it. A burning away of the flesh to release eternal glory. Can you imagine the sight? 4 women, one of them with child, stepping into flame because they believed it would open the door to heaven? You see, that is the most terrifying kind of ritual, not one done against your will, but one embraced as salvation. That is control perfected. And it is why this story had to be buried. Because if the faithful knew how easily loyalty could be bent into annihilation, they might begin to question what other rituals, what other doctrines had been twisted for obedience. The story of Whitmore is not isolated. That is why it matters. Across history, men have cloaked power in ritual, cloaked obedience in salvation. Ancient Rome demanded blood in arenas, calling it honor. Medieval Europe demanded tithes and crusades, calling it piety. In Utah it was plural marriage and whispered sacrifice, called celestial glory. Different names, same system. Power survives when people surrender their lives not to force, but to meaning defined by someone else. The women in Whitmore's cabin were not fools. They were not weak. They were strong, devout, intelligent. Rebecca could read German, question doctrine. Sarah was steady and capable. Mary carried life within her. Ruth carried the vigor of youth. And yet all 4 were convinced their highest act was to give themselves to flame. That is not weakness, it is weaponized devotion. And if it could happen there, in a cabin in 1847, how many other places has it happened? Quietly, invisibly, disguised in rituals we call tradition, patriotism, faith, even love? The line between sacrifice and manipulation is razor thin. And most never know they've crossed it until it's too late. But let me ask you something dangerous. What if Whitmore wasn't insane? What if he was right, at least in his own framework? What if the rituals worked? The men who investigated the cabin spoke of weeping under the floor, voices in the wind, presences that lingered. Travelers decades later still felt eyes on them, still heard whispers when snow fell. Energy does not vanish. Belief does not vanish. Ritual leaves scars not just on memory but on the land itself. The bishop thought silence would protect the faithful. But silence allowed something else to grow. Perhaps what Whitmore unleashed wasn't just madness, it was a door. And doors, once opened, do not close. Ask yourself this: when 4 women step into fire believing they ascend, where do they go? Into heaven? Into nothing? Or into something else? Something that now watches anyone who dares to remember their names? This is why stories are buried. Not just to protect institutions, but to protect the rest of us from truths we might not survive knowing. And yet, you are hearing it now. Which means the door is open for you too. When the cabin was found in 1920, the officials who arrived on site had 2 choices: expose or contain. They chose containment. The purses, the journals, the clothing, all taken. The artifacts were labeled not as evidence but as sensitive materials, and locked in the basement archives of Salt Lake headquarters. The chamber was resealed, the chapel finished above it, a house of worship built on top of a house of fire. Think about that. Every Sunday, hymns rose into rafters while below, the ashes of women whispered in the dark. That is how institutions manage memory. They don't destroy it. They bury it under ritual until the living forget what the dead cannot. And for 70 years they succeeded. But silence does not erase. Silence amplifies. It builds pressure, waiting for the moment a crack lets truth through. And in Utah, that crack never stays closed for long. Whispers persisted. Farmers in the valley claimed their livestock would not graze near the site of the old cabin. Children spoke of women standing by their beds, clothed in white, faces burned away, humming lullabies no one had taught them. In 1935, a missionary stationed in the area recorded in his diary that he woke every night to the sound of women crying just outside his window. He was told to ignore it. He was told it was the wind. But he swore it was voices calling names: Rebecca, Mary, Sarah, Ruth. You see, the cover-up was never complete. Because memory does not belong to institutions. It belongs to land, to blood, to the people who lived it. And when a story is buried but not healed, it returns in fragments. In dreams, in superstitions, in warnings disguised as ghost tales. Dismiss it if you want. But ask yourself, why do ghost stories cling hardest where blood has been spilled? By the 1960s, whispers reached scholars. Independent historians began asking questions about Whitmore's journals, about blood atonement, about women disappearing in pioneer records. They were met with stone walls, missing documents, locked archives. One researcher, Ellen Griggs, claimed she had seen the letters of the wives herself during a supervised visit to the archives in 1967. She described them as eerily calm, written with steady hands, each signed with faith. 2 weeks after giving an interview about them, she retracted her statement. Publicly, she said she had misremembered. Privately, she told a friend, "They told me I didn't see what I saw. But I did. I can still see their handwriting when I close my eyes." That is how memory is erased. Not by burning pages, but by convincing you to doubt yourself until silence feels safer than truth. Think about obedience. Most people believe obedience is about rules. But obedience is really about fear. The fear of being cast out, of losing your place, of losing meaning itself. The Whitmore wives did not fear death. They feared disobedience. They feared betraying the covenant, being cut off from the eternal family they had been promised. That fear was stronger than fire. That fear led them to step into it. And that fear still exists today. How many of your choices are truly yours, and how many are shaped by fear of rejection, fear of punishment, fear of being nothing without the group that claims you? This is not just a story about Utah. It is a story about control. And it is a story about you. Now, let me tell you something that was never meant to be spoken. The 1920 discovery did not end the story. Because in the 1970s, another excavation uncovered fragments of the journals, pages the officials had missed. They described something more. They spoke of a covenant circle, not of 4 but of 12. 4 women were the first offering, but Whitmore believed more were to come. He wrote, "The pattern has only begun. The circle must be complete. 12 for the gates of Zion. 12 for the crowning of the kingdom." Do you understand what that means? For deaths were not the end. They were the beginning of a blueprint never finished. A ritual incomplete. And unfinished rituals do not rest. They linger. They wait for someone else willing to finish what was started. Unfinished rituals are not abandoned, they are suspended. That is the nature of belief. If you convince people that eternity hinges on a pattern, then breaking that pattern does not dissolve the promise. It intensifies it. It creates an open wound in faith, a hunger that will not heal until the pattern is completed. Whitmore's writings hinted at this hunger. If not us, then others. If not now, then later. The fire waits. The circle must be sealed. He believed death was not failure but delay. And so, though the fires of 1847 burned out, the doctrine remained like glowing embers buried in ash, waiting for a breath, a hand, a whisper to reignite them. Look at the records carefully. After Whitmore's wives vanished, 3 other families in neighboring settlements reported disappearances in the years that followed. Daughters, sisters, young brides, women who simply slipped out of the census rolls. No graves. No obituaries. Gone. And though no evidence linked these vanishings to Whitmore, the pattern is clear. Isolated households. Women devoutly bound to faith. And silence from the men around them. Were they taken? Were they persuaded? Or did they step willingly into another circle of fire, unseen by outsiders? We cannot know. But what we do know is this. Whenever people vanish without explanation, institutions rush to explain it away. Runaway. Illness. Poor record keeping. But you and I know better. Vanishing is a sign. A thread in a larger design. The 1980s brought another whisper. A construction crew repairing the chapel foundation reported finding blackened stones arranged in a circle beneath the flooring. When they questioned their supervisor, they were told to cover it and say nothing. They obeyed. Yet one worker years later confessed he still dreamed of women's voices echoing out of the cracks, begging him not to fill them. His wife swore he woke screaming, whispering the names, Rebecca, Sarah, Mary, Ruth, always the same 4. Do you see the weight of it now? It is not simply a tale of the past. It is the persistence of ritual across generations. The persistence of memory that refuses to die no matter how deep it is buried. This is where the danger turns toward you. Because memory is contagious. Once you hear the story, you carry it. Once you know the names, you are part of its echo. That is why silence was enforced. Not to protect reputations, but to prevent transmission. The Wives' Act was a covenant, and covenants are binding even on those who witnessed them secondhand. Why do you think their names survived when so much else was erased? Because the ritual was unfinished. Their memory seeks completion. They are still recruiting, still reaching, still whispering. And now you've heard them too. If you feel chills, if you sense eyes on you as you listen, understand, that is how they find you. Not through fire. Through attention. Through memory. Through the act of remembering what you were never meant to know. And so I will ask something of you. Not for me, for them. If you have listened this far, you are already marked. The wives will not rest until their names are spoken, until the circle is acknowledged. Write their covenant in the comments. Not once, twice, as it was intended. The phrase is this: the circle must be sealed. Write it 2 times, and in doing so you both honor and contain them. Refuse, and you risk carrying their hunger with you, letting it whisper in your sleep. Do not mistake this for superstition. Words bind. Rituals endure. And the unfinished circle is watching. Now, it is your turn to decide whether you close it or whether it closes on you. You may be wondering, if all of this is real, where are the records now? The truth is, the records were never destroyed. They were absorbed. In 1994, a former archivist anonymously claimed that the Whitmore files had been reclassified under sealed ecclesiastical materials and transferred to a vault in Little Cottonwood Canyon. You know the one I mean, the Granite Mountain Vault. Fireproof, bomb-proof, earthquake-proof. A place designed not to share truth, but to hold it hostage forever. And what else is hidden there behind 6-ton doors and climate-controlled chambers? Not just genealogy, not just photographs, secrets that could unravel the trust of millions. Whitmore's circle is not the only ritual they buried. It is simply the one that refuses to stay silent. But let us look at the pattern in another light. Whitmore believed 4 sacrifices were the foundation of 12. 12 gates, 12 offerings, 12 lives bound together. You have seen this number everywhere. 12 apostles, 12 tribes, 12 foundations of the New Jerusalem. 12 is a seal. And what happens when 4 are taken but 8 remain? You have an unfinished design. A gap. A hunger. Look at Utah's history after Whitmore. Cycles of disappearance, cycles of scandal, cycles of unexplained silence. Always clustered in numbers that approach 12 but never completed. Almost as if someone somewhere was still keeping count. Here is what chills me most. Every 30 years the pattern stirs. 1847, 1880s, 1920s, 1950s, 1980s, and now, our own time. Every cycle whispers emerge. Every cycle discoveries surface then vanish. Every cycle people disappear into silence. If you think this is coincidence, ask yourself, why do the echoes always return? Why do they never truly fade? Because the covenant was not abandoned. It was postponed. And postponed rituals do not die. They wait, patient as fire beneath stone, until someone dares lift the lid again. And we must speak of obedience again because obedience is the true flame. Whitmore's wives did not burn out of passion. They burned because they believed obedience was salvation. Look around you. How many today still give their lives away in the name of obedience? Not always in fire but in subtler ways. Obedience to employers. Obedience to governments. Obedience to doctrines that demand silence over truth. Whitmore was not unique. He was simply honest about what obedience really requires. Not your labor, not your loyalty, but your very self. The fire was only a mirror for the surrender he demanded. And that same mirror stands before you today. Now comes the part you were never meant to hear. In 2017, a team of surveyors uncovered strange soil disturbances near the chapel grounds once more. They reported finding fragments of women's shoes, rusted buttons, and blackened earth beneath the newer foundation stones. The site was immediately closed, fenced, and reclassified as unstable ground. No official report was ever filed. But one of those surveyors leaked a photograph to an anonymous forum. In the image, 4 scorched stones lie arranged in a circle. Just like before. The ritual was not sealed. The circle was not broken. And if Whitmore's design is still buried in the soil of Utah, then every person who walks above it, every hymn sung, every prayer whispered, is unknowingly feeding the fire below. The circle waits. And it is still hungry. Think about Utah now. A place presented as safe, orderly, wholesome. But patterns don't die just because the buildings change. Beneath manicured streets and gleaming temples lie older foundations, older stones, older scars. And the circle still lingers, waiting to be completed. How do you know this? Look at the silence. Whenever a disappearance makes local news, it vanishes from headlines within weeks. Whenever records contradict themselves, files are corrected. Whenever someone digs too deep, they recant. Do you think silence is accidental? No. Silence is ritual. Silence is obedience. And obedience keeps the fire alive. Now consider this. In 2005, an anonymous manuscript surfaced on a message board frequented by ex-members of high-demand groups. It was titled "The Circle Must Be Sealed." The author claimed to be a descendant of one of Whitmore's wives. They wrote that every generation had been visited by dreams of fire, dreams of women calling their names. They claimed they were warned that the covenant was close to completion, that new offerings had already been chosen. Within days, the manuscript vanished. The thread was deleted. The user account erased. Yet fragments were saved by readers, lines that read, 4 was foundation, 8 remain. I have seen their faces. They do not know yet what they carry. And here is something stranger. In 2012, police records in Utah show a cluster of missing persons cases. Young women, most in their 20s, all last seen within a 100-mile radius of Salt Lake. The cases were never connected publicly, but a private investigator noticed a pattern. Each woman had a religious background. Each was last reported wearing white. And each vanished without trace, as if stepping off the map. Official reports list them as unresolved. But if you know the pattern, if you remember Whitmore's words, you understand. The circle is still feeding. Quietly, carefully, methodically. You may want to dismiss this as superstition, as folklore, as paranoia. But let me ask you this: why do numbers repeat? Why do stories of fire and women and circles of stone echo across centuries? Why do people dream of the same names, Rebecca, Sarah, Mary, Ruth, without ever reading the lost journals? There is only one explanation: the ritual is alive. Not in imagination, not in metaphor. Alive in the way disease is alive. Spreading, infecting, reproducing through memory and obedience. You heard it tonight. You carried it with you. And now the circle knows you too. And here's the most dangerous part. The covenant is not just about Utah. Not anymore. Patterns migrate. Rituals adapt. Whitmore planted the seed, but unfinished rituals are like viruses. They seek hosts. Any community built on obedience can carry it forward. Any institution that prizes silence over truth can become the next fire pit. And so, if you think you are safe because you are not in Utah, you are wrong. The circle does not need geography. It needs obedience. It needs silence. It needs you to look away. If you have ever obeyed against your conscience, ever stayed silent when truth burned in you, then you have already fed the fire. The circle is closer than you think. By now you may have felt it, the sense that someone is standing just behind you, listening along. That is not paranoia. That is transmission. Stories like this are not inert. They are containers. They carry memory, and memory carries obligation. Once you have heard the covenant, it presses on you the same way it pressed on Whitmore's wives. Not because you believe, not because you want to, but because the circle does not need permission. It only needs attention. And attention you have already given. There are 3 ways the covenant finds you. The first is dreams. If you dream of fire within the next 3 nights, you will know you are chosen to carry memory. If you dream of women in white, they will whisper the names. If you dream of both, the fire and the women, you will not escape without leaving something of yourself behind. The second way is silence. If you feel unable to speak of what you heard tonight, if words catch in your throat when you try to explain it to someone else, that silence is not yours. It belongs to them. The third way is reflection. You may see faces in glass or water where none should be. They are not strangers. They are the ones who burned, looking back through you. Do not tell yourself that walking away is protection. Abandoning knowledge does not dissolve its weight. In fact, the circle feeds most powerfully on denial. The wives themselves were not coerced. They stepped forward because to turn away would have been worse. That is how obedience works. It convinces you that refusal is more dangerous than surrender. And so if you try to forget this story, it will only return harder, louder, hungrier. Forgetting is another form of obedience. You might wonder then why I am telling you this. Why pass along something so heavy, so dangerous? The answer is simple, because the only way to contain the covenant is to share it. Passing the memory forward dilutes its hold on any one person. If one hears it, the circle is tight. If many hear it, the circle stretches thin. The wives understood this, though no one recorded it. Fire is not only destruction. Fire is also transmission. A single flame dies. 1,000 sparks scatter. Which will you become? A flame consumed or a spark that escapes? Now I will tell you the final sign. If after hearing this you encounter the phrase, "The circle must be sealed," written unexpectedly, online, in a book, in a note left where it should not be, do not ignore it. That is the covenant speaking through the cracks. It is not random. It is not coincidence. It is invitation. And once you see it, you must respond. 2 times. No more, no less. If you refuse, the hunger sharpens. If you obey, the hunger quiets, for a while. This is not folklore. This is not story. This is instruction. And if you think you can laugh it off, wait until the night comes, and the fire presses against your window like breath. Do not deceive yourself. Hearing this has already marked you. The covenant always demands proof. Proof of awareness. Proof of obedience. Proof that you are listening not idly but fully. Tonight you may notice something subtle. A sound at the edge of hearing. A knock, a scrape, a faint whisper in the walls. That is not imagination. That is the first test. It does not matter if you live in a crowded city or in the silence of the desert. When the sound comes, it comes from inside. And you will know it because it will arrive at the exact moment you are most certain you are alone. The second test is more invasive. You will begin to notice faces and places they do not belong. Not ghostly shapes, no. Real faces, fleeting and sharp, caught in the corner of mirrors or in the black glass of a phone when the screen goes dark. They will not be strangers. They will be familiar. Friends, family, lovers. Except each face will hold the same expression. Pleading, imploring, warning. And you will not know what they are warning you against. Until you remember this story. Until you recall Whitmore. Until you feel the circle tightening. The third test strikes at your speech. You will try to tell someone about this. Someone close, someone you trust. The words will not come easily. Your throat will dry. Your tongue will falter. And in the silence, you will hear a voice that does not belong to you, whispering from the hollow of your chest. It will say, "Obedience is survival." If you deny the voice, it will return louder the next night. If you obey, you will fall deeper. The test is not about belief. It is about obedience. Always obedience. But there is a fourth test, one that only comes to those who resist. You may begin to lose time. A glance at the clock will show hours missing, hours you cannot account for. Doors you know you locked will be standing open. Candles you never lit will be burning. And when you see the flame, it will not flicker like normal fire. It will burn steady. So, watching. As if the fire itself is aware. This is the fire that took the wives. This is the fire that remembers. And now it remembers you. Understand this. These tests are not punishments. They are invitations. Whitmore offered his wives the fire as proof of devotion. You are being offered the same proof in different form. And if you think you can refuse, ask yourself, how many before you thought the same? How many heard, dismissed, laughed, only to be found silent weeks later? The covenant does not require your belief. It only requires your attention. And you have already given it. The circle is open. The tests have begun. And soon you will understand why no one escapes untouched. When you wake tomorrow, do not be surprised if you feel watched. The sensation will not fade with daylight. You will glance at windows expecting to see someone outside. You will feel the heaviness of eyes though no one is there. This is the covenant's way of reminding you that you are not free. That freedom was surrendered the moment you listened past the warnings. Whitmore's wives felt it too, the constant weight of being observed, judged, measured. And now, like them, you will feel it until you give something back. Your routines will begin to fracture. Keys will vanish from where you left them, only to appear in impossible places. Lights will flicker in patterns you swear resemble breathing. You will walk into a room and smell ash, though nothing has burned. And when you try to explain it, others will dismiss you, laugh, or grow uneasy and change the subject. This is not incompetence. This is design. The covenant isolates you the same way it isolated the wives, until silence becomes the only language left. Then the names will come, perhaps whispered in dreams, perhaps spoken by strangers on the street who could not possibly know. Rebecca, Sarah, Mary, Ruth. Again and again until they feel like bruises on your memory. These names are not random. They are doorways, reminders that the covenant has always demanded women to carry its weight. But do not think yourself safe if you are not a woman. The covenant adapts. It takes what it needs. It uses who it must. Gender, age, belief, none of it shields you when the circle is hungry. By this point, you will have only two choices: silence or transmission. If you keep this to yourself, the hunger will coil tighter. You will feel it in your chest, a pressure like smoke filling your lungs. But if you pass the story forward, if you scatter the sparks into other minds, the weight lessens. That is why you were told this tonight. Not to be entertained, not to be frightened, but to become a vessel. The wives burned so the covenant could live. You speak so it can scatter. Either way the circle feeds. So here is the final truth. The covenant does not end with Whitmore. It does not end with Utah. It does not end with you. It is a circle, and a circle does not end. But you can decide how it continues. You can choose silence and let the fire press closer until you cannot breathe. Or you can choose obedience and speak the words it craves. The circle must be sealed. Write them. Twice. Scatter them into the world. That is how you survive. That is how you pass the hunger forward. The wives are watching. The fire is waiting. And now, it is your turn.